pozwalam sobie zaprosić na scenę Richarda Dawkinsa. Zapraszam także na scenę profesora Pawła Golika. Welcome to the stage, Richard Dawkins. I can only regret very much that could not be a part of this wonderful, wonderful show. And now, I think I don't need to introduce to you Professor Richard Dawkins. Not only you have it in your brochures, but you are here, I know, all of you are here because of Richard Dawkins. And you know very well who is he. Just maybe 2 or 3 words. Famous, world-famous scientist. Maybe the most famous popularizer of, promoter of science in the world, and also #1 atheist. First part, we will have our interview in 2 parts. The first part will concern scientific matters, and it will be Professor Golik who will ask questions.
So let me maybe start with a question that is somehow in between atheism and science. A few months ago, an eminent Polish astronomer published an essay in which he stated that, according to him, modern physics is much closer to God than physics of the 19th century, and that for him, belief in God is only rational. He sees it in the laws of the universe, in the fact that the universe is governed by mathematical laws. He states that the foundation of rationalism is that every effect has a cause, so there had to be the primary cause for all the laws for the Big Bang, that the recent developments of quantum theory prove free will, that the quantum uncertainty principle is the place to find God, etc. How to discuss, how to debate such kinds of things? Because we are used to debating creationists, and it's easy because they talk nonsense. But here you have an eminent physicist with Nature papers under his belt telling us that maybe we are atheists because we are too stupid to understand quantum physics. How would you answer him?
Does this work? Is the microphone working? Yeah. Well, certainly, it's a lot easier to reply to theists who use biology than who use physics. That was the opposite of what William Paley in the 18th century thought. He thought that biology was the best place to prove natural theology, and physics was yes, that's right, and physics was harder. I think that point of view you just described is an utter betrayal of everything that science stands for. in the business, especially my field of evolution, we are in the business of explaining complexity in terms of simplicity. So in evolution, we start with primeval simplicity. We start with a self-replicating molecule. That's complex enough, but it's still very, very simple compared to the complexity of all of us and everything else that we see around us. So our science is in the business of explaining the difficult to understand, which is complex, in terms of the relatively easy to understand, which is simplicity. Now, if you smuggle in a complex creator at the very outset of the universe, that is a complete and utter betrayal of the whole scientific enterprise. You might as well say we give up, we surrender, we don't understand, therefore God did it. That is cowardice. It is lying down under the problem instead of trying to solve the problem. Now, I'm not a physicist, but I have talked to physicists, and I understand the nature of the problem that they face. The origin of the universe, the origin of the laws of physics is not fully understood. Physicists don't understand where the fundamental constants of nature come from, these half dozen or so numbers which physicists can measure, but they don't have an explanation for where they come from. The theist temptation is to say, oh, we don't understand, therefore God made up those constants. It's as though in the origin of the cosmos there were some knobs that you twiddle, or like rheostats on a radio set, and you turn them to a particular value. And it is true that if the knobs were twiddled to ever so slightly different from the value that they hold, then the universe as we know it would not come into existence, chemistry would not come into existence, galaxies would not come into existence, life would not come into existence. The universe is fine-tuned as if it knew we were coming. That's the way the theists put it. As I said, that is a cowardly way out. Some physicists say, well, we just don't understand, and one day we will, or maybe we will, we hope we will. Other physicists use a rather powerful idea, which is the metaverse, the multiverse, where they postulate on other grounds, not as a device to solve this fine-tuning problem, but on other grounds to do with the inflationary model. They postulate a multiverse where there are millions of universes, all of which have different values of the fundamental constants, and only a very few of them, because of the fine-tuning argument, only a very few of them have exactly the right values, as it happens, exactly the right values to give rise to galaxies and chemistry and life and so on. And obviously, this is the anthropic principle, obviously we have to be living in one of that minority of universes in which the fundamental constants are correctly set. So there is no divine knob twiddler who's setting these constants to exactly the right values. We live in the kind of universe that could give rise to us because we are here. That's the anthropic principle. So I return to my original statement. The physicist you're talking about is an intellectual coward.
I agree. And also, I always wanted to ask him, how do you know this universal lawmaker was your Catholic God and not the flying spaghetti monster or Odin or whoever?
Yes. Yes.
How do you know that?
I did hear of an American astronomer who writes learned papers in astronomical journals, mathematical papers which make the assumption that the universe is 13 point whatever it is billion years old, nearly 14 billion years old. But privately, he believes that the universe is only 6,000 years old. He somehow manages to hold down a job in an astronomy department in an American university.
You would probably need a very good neuroscientist to explain what's going on in this person's head. Yes. Another question, as I humbly tried to explain yesterday, evolutionary biology is a very much live discipline which keeps progressing, and you've left your mark on it with your work on the gene-centric model of evolution, with your work on the extended phenotype. So now, if you were to advise very junior undergraduate students who are just embarking on their journey in evolutionary biology, where would you advise them to look for things to solve, for things to do?
First, can I say how much I enjoyed your talk? Could I say how much I enjoyed your talk yesterday and how much I actually learned from it of how to explain these things? I always hate the what advice would I give to young people question. I never know how to answer it. I suppose that if I were a young person going into evolutionary biology now, I would have to say you've got to get molecular. You would have to make yourself familiar with the astonishing modern experimental techniques which are enabling people to actually read letter by letter at great speed the genetic code of any living creature. It is an amazing fact which would have astounded Darwin, I think, that life at its base is digital. Life at its base is a branch of computer science. It's a branch of information technology. With hindsight, I think we can say it had to be that way, but we didn't realize that until it was discovered that it was that way. That at the bottom, genetics, the determination of the way life is all to do with digital genetics. It's quaternary rather than binary, but otherwise it really is just straight information technology. And the power of the technique of DNA sequencing, protein sequencing, is immense. You can use it, for example, to compare any two animals or plants, any two living organisms, letter by letter, exactly as a biblical scholar might compare two scrolls of Isaiah or something like that, and look at different letter changes and say, how long ago did the common ancestor of these two animals live? So in the case of humans and chimpanzees, it's between about 6 or 7 million years ago. Between humans and gorillas, it's a bit longer. Between humans and old world monkeys, it might be 20 million years. Between humans and snails, it would be way back in the Precambrian, maybe 1 billion years ago. And it's an astonishing fact that for any of those ancestors, say we take the ancestor of ourselves and chimpanzees 6 or 7 million years ago, there was a mother, an ape female, who had 2 children, at least had 2 children, siblings who may have played together in the forest. One of them was destined to become our ancestor, the other was destined to become the ancestor of chimpanzees. It literally was 2 siblings born to one mother. I find that an amazing fact. And you think it out, you work it out, it's got to be true. Molecular biology enables you to put a date on, approximately a date on, when each branch point occurred. In principle, since it's possible to decode the genome of any 2 animals, you can work out, it will be possible to work out the entire family tree of the whole of life. Every detail of the pedigree of the whole of life is in principle within our grasp. That would have amazed Darwin. He would have been overjoyed at that possibility. That is the power of molecular genetics. And I think if you're going to be an experimental biologist, you've probably got to be in there.
Thank you very much. And maybe one last scientific question. I was reluctant to ask it because Nina told me it would be too technical, but I do trust you will be able to explain it. In the field of modern evolutionary biology, we have nowadays 2 camps. One which maintains that what we have is the gradual incorporation of new discoveries, mostly in genetics, into what is essentially the unchanged evolutionary synthesis, and the other one which calls for something radically new called extended synthesis, which would be a, qualitatively different theory than the extant one, citing fields like epigenetics, like niche construction, etc. Where do you stand on this in this debate, and how would you explain it to our guests?
Well, first, I was delighted by your put down of epigenetics yesterday. Epigenetics is just embryology. It's how different cells differentiate in the developing embryo. It's why liver cells are different from muscle cells, and muscle cells are different from bone cells, etc. That's epigenetics. It's become a kind of trendy word with its 15 minutes of fame, because some people are talking about inheritance going through to the next generation of these epigenetic turning on of genes. Some genes in the developing embryo are turned on, and others in different cells. And there is some controversial evidence that that may be inherited. It sounds like a form of Lamarckian inheritance. It isn't. It's not very important. Now, the question about extended evolutionary synthesis. Yes, it's always a good idea for scientists to be on the alert for a revolutionary change when it's necessary. On the other hand, there's also a tendency in the history of science for people wishing to make a name for themselves, trying to say that what they've got to say is more revolutionary than it really is. And my feeling is rather biased towards the latter. I think that there really was a genuine advance, a genuine revolution in Darwinism in the 1930s with the modern synthesis, which I regard as being the work largely of Fisher, Haldane, and Wright, and other people as well, Meyer and Dobzhansky, where Mendelian genetics, digital genetics, was incorporated into Darwinism. That, I think, deserves the title of a major revolution, and it's something that I think Darwin would have welcomed, because it answered some problems that Darwin had, and you mentioned this, the Fleming-Jenkin criticism that natural selection would be impossible because variation would disappear, would be swamped. That suggestion, by the way, was obviously nonsense right from the start. If it were true that variation was swamped as the generations go by, then we'd all look more alike than our grandparents' generation. Mixing two colored paints together causes an intermediate one. You mix red paint and blue paint, you get purple paint, and no amount of mixing purple paint with purple paint reconstitutes red and blue. That was the argument that was made. And obviously it doesn't happen. We remain as variable as we were before. This was actually pointed out algebraically in the beginning of the 20th century by Hardy and Weinberg. I don't think that there is a major revolution since the modern synthesis of the 1930s. I think that the contribution of W.D. Hamilton in the 1960s was a pretty major one, but it was just an addition to the modern synthesis, and the so-called extended evolutionary synthesis, I think, is a publicity grab.
Yes. I would also add Kimura and his mathematical description of drift and the interplay between drift and selection as another major milestone. Yes, but then yes, it all fits into the great framework that starts with Darwinism and remains difficult to explain to non-biologists, maybe because of the fundamental lack of direction, lack of aim, lack of what the philosophers call telos in evolution. I believe that's one of the roots of the problems we have with, getting with the message of evolution to the people.
Yes, genetic drift is an important thing, and you mentioned it in your lecture. If you look at evolutionary change at the level of molecular genetics, then the majority of evolutionary change is random. But of course, that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is the bit that causes wings to be good at flying, and bones to be good at structure, and brains to be good at thinking, and eyes good at seeing. Adaptive evolution only comes about through selection, and drift is irrelevant to that. But at a molecular level, drift is important. What I was talking about earlier, the dating of branch points, the molecular clock, it depends upon drift. If it wasn't there, then you couldn't really do it.
Now it is my turn. Thank you very much, Paweł, for those questions, scientific questions that I would be completely unable to ask. Now I would like to ask Richard Dawkins about some matters, atheistic matters. And before I ask you the question, I would like to say that I asked my colleagues, my atheist colleagues, I asked them what you would like to ask Richard Dawkins, and I received many answers. Amongst them, one was repeatedly came. It was about how to unite the atheist movement globally, nationally. And before I ask you this question, I still would like to mention something. We are, as you could see in our presentation, we are doing 2-3 gatherings, atheist gatherings per year. And since 2014, we've been dealing with the atheists of all kinds. All of them were atheists, but some were misogynistic, some were homophobic, some were anti-Semitic, etc., etc. So we were trying very hard to convince them to change their mind or to change the company. And for the time being, I think our participants of our gatherings are a kind of humanist atheists. So taking all this into consideration, all those differences that could be and are among the atheists that separate them, how do you think, if it's possible at all, to unite the atheist movement to build a very powerful, big movement?
Or do we really need to?
And do we really need to? But it is very often asked question. I don't want to give my personal answer to it now. I would like to ask the atheist #1 in the world.
Well, I can only say I think we should be polite and civil and kind and respect different people's opinion, argue strongly with them, using evidence where it's available to argue if you disagree with somebody, but don't yell and don't condemn people who disagree with you and in the sort of shocking way that we saw in the film of Muhammad being stifled by the moderator in the film, who didn't let him get a word in edgeways and then condemned him for what he didn't say. So we must not do that kind of thing, and I fear that there is a tendency in our movement to see something similar to that. There is a woman called Posey Parker who last week was attempting to hold a feminist rally in New Zealand, in Auckland, and she was shouted down by trans activists and very nearly trampled underfoot by these people who would not let her speak because they have a hostility to the kind of feminism that she represented. And I think there is absolutely no place in our movement for that kind of intolerant refusal to let people speak. We need to speak, we need to listen to each other, we need to discuss our differences in a civil way. The internet doesn't help, of course, because the internet is fostering rudeness, impoliteness, partly because of anonymity, because people shelter behind anonymous nicknames rather than their own name, and partly because the way the internet is, the way social media is set up, is you go for a maximum number of clicks, and unfortunately, impolite yelling on the internet generates clicks, and that generates advertising revenue, and that is something I'm not sure that I don't know how to deal with that. But within our movement, I would appeal for civility, politeness, and listening to each other.
I'm very sorry, maybe I would like to insist a little bit further on it, because being polite or not being polite is one thing. We can have very polite people who, however, are still anti-Semitic or are still, what I said before, misogynistic, homophobic,
and anti-Semitic and that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yes.
Can we accept it to build a very powerful, united movement of atheists?
Well, I suppose there might be certain things like anti-Semitism, which we might regard as being beyond the pale, but we should even argue about that. I mentioned the shutting down of Posey Parker's feminist debate. I mean, we see a similar thing in Britain over J.K. Rowling, the novelist who gets death threats from the trans lobby. And this, again, is shocking to me, that somebody who simply has a reasonable feminist point of view should be victimized in this way.
Okay. So then, do you believe that we are able, I mean, atheists in Poland and in other countries, to build a stronger atheist movement? Because for the time being, nationally in Poland and internationally, this movement is very much divided. What can we do about it? Do you mean
divided? I mean, atheists in Poland surely feel united with atheists in the rest of the world.
Also to
Yes.
Enter and as part of the big international movement, global movement, which, as Pavel asked, do we need? What is your feeling about it? Do we need a really big movement based on atheism?
Well, I think we do. My bias is to base it on science, and I think we have at least two perhaps major reasons why people join atheist organizations. That people like me who are interested in scientific truth and who feel that religion is antipathetic to scientific truth, and there are other people who are coming from a more ethical, moral, political point of view. I think they're both important, and who become atheists because they are bitterly opposed to, for example, the Catholic stance on abortion. I mean, I'm sympathetic to both, but my own, insofar as I have any rhetoric to offer, it tends to be on the scientific side, on the side of religion as an enemy of scientific truth. Others see religion as an enemy of ethics, really.
If I understand well from what you are saying, it is, and I would agree fully with it, it is not enough to be just an atheist. We know, for example, in the Czech Republic, there are many atheists, at least non-believers, and still there are many people who represent unscientific, pseudoscientific, or other harmful ideas.
Yes, that's also something I wanted to ask, that your books, like Outgrowing God, are mostly optimistic because they follow your experience where you can outgrow religion by going into science that gives you all the wonder a person ever needs. However, what we are observing is that even as in the, broadly speaking, Western societies, religion is in decline, it doesn't mean that reason is on the rise. People seem to be replacing one kind of delusion with another kind of delusion. Maybe you lose people going to there are less people going to the churches, but you have anti-vaxxers, you have flat earthers who are not a joke, but a real thing which never ceases to amaze me, and you have all kinds of new age movements, etc. Are we really able to outgrow delusions, or are we just swapping one delusion for another?
Yes, I mean, I almost despair when I contemplate the fact that you've drawn attention to. It's hard to know quite what it's about. I think partly the internet may be to blame. We've heard somebody, I think it was Mohammed, talking about bubbles, and of course the internet does foster the bubble phenomenon, the hall of mirrors, where you only meet people on the internet who agree with you, and so you seek out other flat earthers or other anti-vaxxers or other astrologers or homeopaths and people like that, and so you are facilitated in your delusion by the fact that you only ever meet other people who are similarly deluded, and you think, oh, I'm part of a big club. The flat earthers are on the move. We're going places, and I think we all ought to try to get outside our bubbles. This is why in addition to reading The Guardian in Britain, I read The Telegraph as well, which is against my political opinion, but I feel I ought to try to break out of the bubble that I'm in danger of getting into. I confess myself pretty baffled, actually, by the fact that when people give up religion, if you're right, they tend to go for other kinds of nonsense. The pessimistic diagnosis would be that the human psychology needs to believe in something independently of evidence. My great appeal is only believe what there is evidence for. If anybody tells you they believe something, say, what is the evidence for that? What grounds do you have for believing in it? Unfortunately, there is quite a bit of evidence, I think psychologists here may confirm it, that a major influence on what we in the general sort of human sense, we believe, tends to be that which is good for what we perceive as our tribe. So if we belong to the Catholic tribe, then we don't really bother with the evidence for transubstantiation and the Trinity and things like that. But we are brought up Catholic, and therefore we accept whatever the Catholic tribe believes. And the flat earthers have formed their own tribe. In politics, in American politics, the Republican tribe believes in guns and God and stopping abortion and racism, and the Democrat tribe believes in the opposite. And there's evidence that, well, there's a particularly disturbing experiment which was described by Steven Pinker in his latest book, Rationality. I can't remember quite how it goes, but people in psychological experiments were confronted with some data which purported to show that that gun control did not reduce the murder rate. Remember, this is hypothetical. This is made-up data, so it's not actually real. But they were presented with evidence that gun control does not reduce violent crime. And they were asked to look at the evidence. And the mathematically sophisticated people were able to see what was wrong with this data. But, this was the interesting point, it was the, I forget which way around it was, whichever party didn't want to believe it were the ones who used their mathematical sophistication to disprove it. Then, a different set of people were presented with exactly the same data, but with the headings changed. So in this case, the data purported to show that gun control did reduce violent crime. And once again, the sophisticated people were able to see through it, but it was the people who politically wanted to believe it who did it. In other words, it was political bias that determined what people ended up believing rather than respect for actual evidence. This is a cautionary tale for all of us, because we are all of us in danger of being biased in favor of our prejudices.
I don't know if it is more optimistic or not, but it seems to me that believing in nonsense is quite independent of believing or not believing in God, because there are many believers who, at the same time, believe in many other kinds of nonsense. And the opposite, there are also atheists who could do it, who cannot cross the road because there is a black cat crossing, etc.
Yes. So you're separating nonsense from religion. I mean, religion is nonsense.
Religion is nonsense, yes, but so cannot be replaced by...
What you're saying is that other kinds of nonsense, like astrology or homeopathy, is equally likely to be believed by atheists?
No,
I don't think so.
I would like to say that this nonsense could be parallel and could coexist with the atheistic worldview,
yes,
and the religion at the same time. I see atheists who believe in some other nonsense than God, and also religious people.
Well, we have a room full of atheists here. Does anybody here believe in homeopathy?
I was speaking just about replacing. Yes, it will be later on. And now...
Any flat earthers? Anybody believe in astrology? I'm glad, that's good news. Yeah.
We have good selection. Professor Dawkins, Richard. And now I would like to ask you not to answer some questions, some separate specific questions, but maybe to send a message to our audience, maybe even more because it is filmed, to other Poles, or maybe Urbi et Orbi, to the atheist from here, from Poland.
So you're asking me to make a speech?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
To leave a message now, just to advise our atheists here, who are gathered here, but also who are elsewhere.
Okay. I will try. You put me on the spot. Well, I will say something about science in a moment, but first of all, perhaps I should try to clarify the rather intemperate remark I made this morning after the abortion thing. What I was trying to say was that here in Poland, you are up against the Roman Catholic Church, which is powerful and a deeply unpleasant organization. But they have their beliefs, and their beliefs include that life begins at conception. Now that human life, human personality, human individuality, human personhood begins at conception. Given that they believe that, all the rhetoric we hear about a woman's body is her own, and it's her own private temple, and it's her right to do what she likes with, that will fall on completely deaf ears. You might as well be talking a different language, because they will say, but the fetus is a person too. Now, we think that's absurd, but that's what we've got to argue. It's no good saying, I'm a woman and I'm entitled to do what I like with my body, because that will cut no ice with religious people who have a different view of the personhood of an embryo. Now, the right way to change their minds, it seems to me, if there's any hope of changing their minds, is to say, actually, you're wrong about personhood beginning at conception. It's a ridiculous belief for all sorts of reasons. For one thing, most pregnancies end in abortion before you even know you're pregnant, so that's God doing the abortion. For another thing, monozygotic twins split after conception, and so if there's a human soul in the zygote, and it then splits to form two identical twins, which one gets the soul? Which one is the zombie? But really, more importantly, why do we care about suffering? We care about suffering because the individual we're talking about is capable of suffering. You cannot suffer unless you have a nervous system. So a full-grown woman is a living, breathing, thinking, feeling person who is capable of suffering, capable of fearing, capable of feeling pain, capable of having her life ruined by being forced to carry a baby to term. That's the point you have to make. Whereas a tiny embryo, I said it was like a worm, and it is. It has no more sense of pain or feeling or fear or unhappiness than a worm does. And so if you're a dyed-in-the-wool vegan, then you have every right to be sympathetic towards an embryo. But if you're not, then you're a hypocrite if you object to abortion. So I feel that that's the right way to try to get things changed in a Catholic country like Poland. You won't get anywhere if you try to say something like, my body's my own, and you keep your hands off it. That's not going to work. Of course, we all believe it here, but it's not going to work. Okay. Now, you want me to say something... All right. Okay, I'll try to say something about why I believe that science. I don't want to call it an alternative religion because I don't like the word religion. But when people give up conventional religion and they put in its place other kinds of nonsense, let's give them something positive to put in its place. Let's give them science. Science is the study of the real world. The only way to understand the truth about the real world is science. First article of my faith, if I can call it that, is there is a real world, and it's not a social construct, it's real, and it is the business of science to understand it. Science has put in place methods for studying it, which include things like peer review, repeating experiments, double-blind trials, meta-analysis. These are all methods for reducing the possibility of fooling yourself, reducing the possibility of being misled. Everybody, scientists are human, and they are in danger of fooling themselves. And so the double-blind control trial, for example, is a beautiful example of a scientific method which is in place precisely to guard against the danger of being fooled, the danger of being biased, because we are all in danger of being biased. Do you understand what the double-blind control trial is? I needn't explain that. Well, okay, briefly, when doctors, medical scientists are comparing, say, a drug, we want to know whether a new drug works, they compare it with a control. So say 100 patients have the drug, 100 patients have the control, and you compare the results. The important thing is neither the doctor nor the nurse nor the patient nor anybody knows which patient gets the drug and which patient gets the control. The secret is locked away in a computer or some equivalent, and the secret is only broken when the experiment has come to a predetermined end. That is a perfect guard against self-deception. And these other various safeguards are all part of the scientific method. Now, why is science so inspiring? The most astonishing fact you will ever have to confront is the fact of your own existence and the fact that you are capable of understanding how you got here. I cannot even begin to convey to you the complexity of your own body. A single cell is an entity of shattering complexity. Multiply that up by trillions, and you get the multicellular body. The brain consists of, forget how many billion neurons connected, getting on for a quadrillion connections between these neurons, and that is what's doing your thinking, that's what's doing your believing for you. This is an amazing thought that the laws of physics, simple as they are, the laws of physics in a process which Darwin discovered and others have refined, the laws of physics have given rise to objects as complicated as you and me. On this planet, possibly only on this planet, the laws of physics have conspired through this process of Darwinian natural selection to give rise to an entity, the human brain, which is so complicated that it can not only see and hear and control behavior and walk about and admire and be moved by beauty and fall in love, but can also understand where it comes from, what process gave rise to it, where it is in the universe, how big the universe is, how old the universe is. This all we owe to science. We are privileged to live in the 21st century when we are allowed to understand things which were a sealed book to our ancestors. Our ancestors could only resort to primitive, naive superstition of the kind that we call religion. We are privileged to have the level of understanding which 21st century people have. We only have one life, and getting to understand how we came to have that life in the first place makes it all worthwhile.
Thank you so much for this very inspirational speech. And now we have our questions and answers session. And so please start. Yes, take your...
I'm the homeopath believer. Well, believer is perhaps an overstatement, but let me put it in perspective. I do not confess to know everything there is to know about homeopathy, or medicine for that matter. But I have empirical, what's the word? So I'm just trying to say everything at once. A lot of positive experience, whereby it can't have been the placebo effect because my two young children were subjected to it. And they were, I'm using the word consciously cured of some recurring diseases. And I myself have had and am still experiencing positive effects of some homeopathic treatment. Now, have I fallen victim of what you, Professor, have called, in my words, I expressed it, fake proof?
Right. I think homeopathy is a special case. All other kinds of alternative medicine, you can say something like this: if they work, then they will be incorporated into medicine. Homeopathy is a special case for the following reason. If you imagine, well, first of all, homeopathy, as you know, involves dilution and dilution and dilution and dilution interspersed with succussion, which is shaking. So you take a would-be active ingredient like arnica, and you dilute, and then you succuss. You dilute and you succuss. You take a sample of each succussion and start a new one. Homeopaths believe that the more dilute it is, the more effective it is. The most effective dilution is, I forget exactly what they call it, but it's something like 30-something or other. And James Randi calculated that it's equivalent to 1 molecule of the active ingredient in a volume of water equal to the size of the solar system. Now, what this means is that if you were to do a double-blind control experiment where you had the dose and the control, and you had 100 patients with the dose and 100 patients with the control, there could not be a difference between them because there's no difference between the dose and the control. That's the special case of homeopathy. Now, they do get around that by saying, but the water has a memory. And although there is no molecule left of the original ingredient, the original active so-called ingredient, the water has a memory of the shape of the molecule. And it's that, and the succussion is what has preserved that. Now, it would be possible to do a proper experiment to test that. It would be a rather elaborate experiment, quite simple to do, though. You would have, again, experimental patients and control patients. Every single dose given would be independently diluted and succussed. That's important. It would be no good just having one great vat of homeopathic medicine and one great vat of thing, because anything could be different. It might be one's closer to the window, or one's got a rat dropped in it or something. You've got to do independent dilution and succussion of every one. Now, if any homeopath really believes what they say, they should be doing that experiment. If it came out right, they would get the Nobel Prize for physics as well as the Nobel Prize for medicine. But are they? No, they're not. What they're doing is telling anecdotes like you've just told. Anecdotes are not science. Everybody has stories about getting cured of something. You spontaneously can get better. Most things do get better. You have to do the proper experiment. I invite you to do it. It would be easy but elaborate to do. If it comes out right, you will get the Nobel Prize for physics, but I'm not putting my money on it.
Thank you.
Also, if I may, read on something called survivor's bias. Those who tried homeopathy and it didn't work don't go around telling their tales. So, which is why we may get the false impression that it works, because we don't know the number of cases where it didn't.
Sometimes I hear that people in Poland, atheists in Poland, are calling you, Professor, the Pope of the Atheism. Or, as it was said today, Urbi et Orbi, it's also from the Catholic religion taken, right? This is given by Pope blessing, yeah? So my question is, what do you think about incorporating this religion language into our, I mean by as a metaphor, for example? What do you think about that? And I will say in Polish, sorry, to nie jest zarzut w razie czego, tylko...
So I will say before, it was a pure joke, and I hope that everybody understood it.
Yeah, but I'm also aware that some people, of course it's a joke, but it's also our culture is based, European culture is based on Christianity in some way. We heard this tale so long that we think in this particular way. We think about heaven and hell, stuff like that. Even we don't think about them serious that they exist, but we use them as metaphor. And what do you think about that? Should we do that? Shouldn't we?
I pronounce anathema on anyone who calls me Pope.
Also, if I may observe, Professor Dawkins here does not wear a funny hat. He wears a cool tie. There's a difference. And on a more serious note, Professor Dawkins became a world-famous person because he wrote what I and many others consider the best popular accounts of modern evolutionary theory. The religious leaders got there for being religious. There is a difference between a person who becomes famous for their contribution to science and then uses this position to give message about the falsity of religion, to religious leaders who have never done anything useful in their entire lives, like the popes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tomasz. Professor Dawkins, I wanted to ask you about what is probably most interesting thing in the science, so the unknown. I think it is also relevant in the discussion between theists and atheists. So the very beginning of the life, I think it is important, at least this is my impression, because among my colleagues, believers, I often hear something which I would describe as a mild version of creationism, where they say they admit they do believe in the evolution, but we do not know how the life exactly started. So for them, this is their excuse to say that this is the place, this is the stand where they place their God. And in this regard, I wanted to ask you about the very beginning of the life. I remember in The Selfish Gene, you described what we can say is a chemical evolution, probably, as a start for the biological evolution. You said that you have written about the replicator, which probably was at the beginning in the chemical form, and then biological evolution started from that. Do we know, since the publication of Selfish Gene, more about this? Can, for example, AI help us to find the answer? Do you think, will we find any time the answer for that question? Thank you.
It is still unknown, and it may always be unknown. It happened a very long time ago. I think it's still possible to say that the answer to the kind of answer that we seek really is the first self-replicating entity. And the reason for that is that once you have a self-replicating entity which behaves like DNA, although it wouldn't have been DNA, then natural selection can get going, and you have to have natural selection in order to get the kind of complexity that characterizes life. So I think we kind of already know that it had to be the first replicator, but what that was, nobody knows. The most popular, the most fashionable idea at the moment is the so-called RNA world, where everybody, I think, accepts that DNA is not it. DNA has been called a high-tech replicator, which requires a superstructure of protein and complex cellular activity in order to do its replication. So DNA is not it. DNA needs protein because protein is an enzyme, or proteins make enzymes, and DNA needs enzymes. So we have a kind of catch-22. But RNA can function as an enzyme, not a very good enzyme. It's not as good as protein, but it can work as an enzyme because it can form itself into complicated shapes. And RNA also is a replicator. And so it could be that RNA did both jobs, both the replicator job that was taken over later by DNA and the enzyme job, which was later taken over by protein. So that's one fashionable idea. Whether we'll ever actually know for certain I can't say. I think the best we can hope for is that somebody will come up with a model which is so obviously good, so obviously powerful, that we say, oh, it had to be that way. But I doubt that there'll ever be any direct evidence.
Yes, my question, Dr. Dawkins, is about postmodernism, which is sort of the new religion or the new para-religion on the block, which rejects Enlightenment values and rejects objectivity, and so there's no common truth among different people. Each person may have a different truth, and this is greatly perverted many social movements. I think it's killing the political left, feminism, and the trans movement, and anti-racism have all been infected in various ways. What can we do to counter the influence of this postmodernist para-religion on activist movements?
Your encapsulation of what postmodernism is a lot more lucid than any postmodernist will produce. They seem incapable of even knowing what their own doctrine is, and I've never understood it. And your encapsulation seems to me to be about right. It is pretentious, obscurantist, deliberately goes out of its way to use obscure language that nobody can understand, because that creates an illusion of profundity. The idea that your personal feelings matter more than evidence, I think, is deeply pernicious, and it lies at the heart of quite a lot of the disputes that are coming at us, particularly, unfortunately, from the political left. I'm against it.
So, Professor Dawkins, what's your favorite story about someone leaving the religion behind?
Oh, gosh. I get quite a lot of letters from, and many of them are rather tragic because they involve loss of family connections and people being disowned by their family, and that's, of course, extremely sad. A more positive one, I'm not sure about leaving religion, but we had at Oxford a graduate student who came from a rather obscure American university where he had been taught creationism, and for some reason he got into Oxford to study biology. And he very zealously attended my lectures on evolution, and at the end of the course of lectures he came to the front, and he had been educated in nothing but creationism all his life. He came to the front and he thumped the table and he said, "Gee, this evolution, it really makes sense."
Thank you.
Is it me now? Okay. Professor, I'd like to ask you about questions that keep inspiring you in your work, maybe unanswered questions, maybe from other fields of science, that make you want to get closer and closer to the reality.
Gosh, difficult questions. Well, I'm very interested in language, and partly because I see great analogies between language evolution and biological evolution, although the mechanism is totally different, but there are uncanny similarities between them. And I, just at the moment, for example, I'm interested in languages that have different genders. It seems to me one of the interesting things about languages that English has 3 genders, and they're very simple. Neuter is things that aren't alive, and masculine and feminine are things that are. French has two genders. Everything is either masculine or feminine, even things like tables and chairs. And I have read that there are languages, for example, some East African languages, where there are as many as 15 genders. And I would, if anybody knows anything about this, I'd love to hear it. I'm trying to collect genders.
There is a phenomenon which especially Eastern religions use to prove their point that there must be some beings, and it has been scientifically studied, and it's a phenomenon of past life memories, also called reincarnation. And there were studies at the University of Virginia, Professor Ian Stevenson, and then Dr. Jim Tucker studied this phenomenon for 50 years, wrote many books about it, and science doesn't seem to have an explanation to it. What do you think? Are they fooled, or it's something which has yet to be explained?
I have not looked into this matter in detail, and obviously should do so before giving a too negative answer. I think it is not unreasonable to use the razor attributed to Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And I think Voltaire said something similar. The a priori reason for skepticism for that kind of thing would be that our whole worldview depends upon, the scientific worldview depends upon the idea that nervous systems are born anew in every individual, and there is no known mechanism in the laws of physics or biology whereby information could be transmitted from the distant past. That's not to say that some information might one day not become available, but again, Sagan's razor comes into play. The evidence had better be damn good for us to take it seriously, and I'd be happy to look at the evidence, but I rather suspect that there's a lot of wishful thinking in it. Forgive me for my bias in that respect.
I would like to ask your opinion on present development of artificial intelligence and its influence on human development or evolution, let's call it. Thank you.
Yeah, you call that brief. It's a big question. It's something that strays into the realm of science fiction, and a lot of people are have grave misgivings about it. Misgivings about, for example, the effect upon whether there'll be anything left for humans to do. I take rather a rosy view of science fiction-y kind of advances in the future. I'm excited at the thought of all sorts of changes that might come about. Perhaps at my age that's unusual, but I rather like the idea of if only I could come back in 500 years and see what things have happened. I suspect that artificial intelligence is going to be big. I suspect that machines will be conscious. I see no reason why they should not be conscious, because I am a materialist who believes that consciousness is a manifestation of brain stuff, and therefore, in principle, it must be possible for artificial entities to be conscious. Recently, there's been a lot of publicity about a particular AI called ChatGPT, something like that. I investigated this for an afternoon. I must say I was not impressed at its factual knowledge. I happen to mention the geneticist Helen Spurway, who was a British geneticist, now long dead. She was, by all accounts, a rather abrasive, aggressive personality. I never actually met her, but this AI, ChatGPT, pronounced with great confidence. Helen Spurway was later married to Richard Dawkins. And I then, a couple of weeks later, I repeated the question. I said, was Helen Spurway actually married to Richard Dawkins? And it said, no, she was married to Aldous Huxley. That was equally false. And so it may be good at making conversation. It's not very good at knowing facts, but it's very good at stating them with unbridled confidence.
My question is, we've all heard the song by Dan Barker yesterday. It was Beware of the Dogma. And my exact question is the scientific dogma as bad as every other one? I mean, you can fall into the dogma like the scientific one.
Yes, that's a very important point. Scientists must beware of dogma. Scientists ought not to believe in something because Professor so-and-so believes it. They should always ask what's the evidence, and if the evidence is unclear, then we should say the evidence is unclear. We should never be afraid of saying, I don't know. Scientists actually rather like not knowing because it gives them something to do. So we have to beware of dogma. We have to beware of becoming so wedded to our ideas that we would refuse to listen to contrary evidence. That's one of the advantages of the scientific method, that it has methods in place to suppress that tendency to be biased. But yes, there is a danger of scientific dogma, and there are horror stories, for example, from very eminent scientists of the 19th century. I think Lord Kelvin, one of the great physicists of the 19th century, was quoted as saying something like, heavier than air flying machines are impossible.
That was the inspiration of my question. Exactly.
Yes, okay. X-rays will prove to be a hoax, and radio waves don't exist. Something like that. So these are the horror stories which we have to beware of, and we ought to be alive to the possibility that we are falling into the same kind of trap today.
There is also this unfortunate business of Francis Crick coining the term central dogma in genetics. Yes. It was a joke. Yes. And it's not a dogma, it's a hypothesis that is very well founded in facts, very well tested, but it's not, philosophically, it's not a dogma, it's a scientific hypothesis.
Okej, wygląda na to, że gotowe mamy pytanie.
Cześć, czy nas słyszysz?
Słyszę cię głośno i wyraźnie. Czy jest coś, w czym mogę ci pomóc?
Zadaj jedno pytanie dla Richarda Dawkinsa.
Oczywiście, chętnie zadam pytanie. Jaki jest twój pogląd na rolę sztucznej inteligencji w przyszłości przemysłu filmowego, zwłaszcza w kontekście tworzenia bardziej realistycznych i innowacyjnych efektów wizualnych?
So I got a feeling that she didn't know who you are. So let me try to ask her. Czy wiesz, kim jest Richard Dawkins?
Nie wiem, kim jest Richard. Przepraszam za niedoprecyzowanie w mojej wcześniejszej odpowiedzi. Jeśli chcesz, to możesz mi powiedzieć więcej informacji o Richardzie, aby móc lepiej zadać mu pytanie. W czym mogę ci pomóc?
So let's try in English maybe. I guess the English version should know that knowledge. Could you ask a question for Richard Dawkins?
Sure, I can ask a question for Richard. Please let me know more information about him so I can tailor the question to his background or expertise.
Let's make it easier for him this time. Ask a question about the evolution.
Sure, here's a question for Richard about evolution. What do you think are some of the most important factors driving evolution, and how do these factors vary across different species and environments?
That's impressive.
Finally. Yeah, so let's end the show with that.
I think let's learn a little bit more first.
Professor Dawkins, my name is Dennis. I would like to ask you, it seems to me that there are more atheists among biologists than other scientists. Why do you think this is so?
There is a certain amount of evidence on that. Both the National Academy of Sciences in the United States and the Royal Society in Britain, surveys have been done, and approximately 90% of these eminent scientists in these two organizations are atheist, 90% that is. And one wonders, as Neil deGrasse Tyson has, what's with the remaining 10%? But anyway, there they are. But there is a slight bias in favor of physical scientists being religious as opposed to biological scientists being religious. As I said earlier, this is the reverse of William Paley's diagnosis in 1802, when he said that physical sciences are not ideal for demonstrating the deity because they're not complex enough, with the exception of Saturn's ring. And biology is the place. Nowadays, it's the reverse of the reason that we had earlier, that physics still has mysteries. In a way, you could say physics is still waiting for its Darwin. The explanation of origins in physical sciences is still waiting. In biology, we've had our Darwin, and we've had our successors to Darwin. So there is this. It's not a great bias. It's just marginally significant bias.
I have a question connected to religion also, because Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, writes about the revolution of a mind in a human, in the prehistoric humans, or like Homo sapiens. And with it came imagination. And thanks to imagination, we were able to create these ideas that could connect people, and making it possible to connect more people than this 160 people that you can know at one time. So with this explanation of religion and where it came, what do you think about it?
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, it's been suggested by him and by other people that religion has a kind of function, which is the uniting of people under a kind of banner of belief that brings them together, so they all have a united purpose. And I think it's easy to imagine that when people do have something in common, it might not have to be religion, it might be support of a football team or something. They have something that unites them. It does enable them to achieve something together which they couldn't achieve if they all, if they were like herding cats, as it's been said.
Thank you very much.
Just a short question, but from the future this time. So Arthur C. Clarke wrote, the one who wrote the Odyssey 2001. There was the following book, which was Odyssey 3001. And what I liked very much, he precisely said from the perspective of this time that the religion was recognized as a sickness.
Recognized as what?
As a sickness. As
Your question.
Sickness, yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes, it is a sickness. I've described it as a virus of the mind. It's a virus which is implanted often longitudinally from parent to child. That's the most important way. But also, charismatic preachers can transmit the virus horizontally as well, and it does take people over. It takes the brain over. We saw it in again, I mentioned the example of the television host in Egypt who was preventing Muhammad from speaking. His mind was heavily infected with the virus of Islam, and he was incapable of independent thought. It was just a possessed mind, and you have to pity him, really.
Yeah, but my question is here, because I didn't have time to state it, are there any evidence, suggestions that there may be something in the genome or maybe on the neuropsychological side which would explain the religion and its craziness?
Well, yes, I mean, I've often been asked this question, and the nearest I can come to an answer is the suggestion that gullibility in childhood is evolutionarily valuable. It's very important for children to believe what their parents, what their elders tell them, because the world is a dangerous place, and children cannot be expected to know what's dangerous. They can't be expected to know that you mustn't pick up snakes, you mustn't pick up hot coals, you mustn't go swimming in a river that might contain crocodiles in Africa. And so the child brain is born with a rule of thumb that says, believe what your parents tell you. And by definition, that rule of thumb is incapable of distinguishing sensible beliefs like rivers are dangerous things to swim in Africa. That's sensible, from ridiculous beliefs like you have to pray 5 times a day. or you must have to sacrifice a goat in order to make the rains come. The child brain, by definition, cannot distinguish between the sensible beliefs that are handed down and the ridiculous beliefs that are handed down, and so that's how religions get started. And then it's sufficiently imprinted in the brain that when the child grows up and becomes an adult, they tell the same nonsense stories to their children. So gullibility does have survival value at certain stages in life, and then the sheer power of mimetic inheritance takes over.
Thank you. I have this question because it puzzles me all the time. If we are to change religion for science, we know religion is in the bad hands, but what happens when science is in the bad hands? When people who are maybe neutral, their only connection to science is with a doctor, for instance, and they have a careless doctor or a superstitious doctor. How are we to deal with that kind of people?
Well, again, I think you have to teach people critical thinking and to be evidence-based, and so you have to question the doctor and say, what is the evidence for what you've just told me? And of course, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because the doctor is a kind of authority figure, and unfortunately, doctors are, in my own field of evolution, doctors are unfortunately rather susceptible to creationist beliefs, and there are plenty of creationist doctors, including a very senior one in America who even became, I think, a presidential candidate briefly. He was a very distinguished doctor who believed that the world was 6,000 years old. How you can go to a doctor who believes such things, I don't. My American friends are shocked when I say that, because they say if he's a good doctor, then never mind. But I would never go to a doctor whose worldview was so out of kilter with reality. I wouldn't trust him to diagnose me.
Barbara. Good afternoon. I want to ask about a branch of science called aging, when science tries to understand why beings are going to get old and how to stop it and or reverse the time. And they have amazing results. And
question?
Yes. They are expecting in 50 years we will have treatment for getting old. What is your opinion about this, and if people are prepared to being or living eternal life?
Well, I'm pretty old myself, so I have sympathy with this. I think there's something rather selfish about wishing to go on living when the world is getting so full, and I think there's something to be said for making way for new people to come into the world. However, as a Darwinian, I'm interested in why we age, and this is an interesting question, and I think the best answer was probably given by Peter Medawar, who pointed out that genes tend to mature, tend to have their epigenetic effect, have come into fruition at particular times during development, most of them during embryology, but some of them later. So any lethal gene or sublethal gene which kills you, which doesn't mature until you're 50, has plenty of time to reproduce before it has its lethal effect. And so we are all filled with genes for dying old, but we have very few genes in us for dying young, because we haven't many ancestors who died young. We haven't any ancestors who died when they were children, and we have rather few ancestors who died in their 20s, and a few more died in their 30s, and rather a lot of people who died, rather a lot of ancestors who died in their 80s, which is what I am. So there is a natural selection filter in favor of genes that make you die old, as opposed to genes that make you die young. So we are all, as it were, dustbins full of genes that mature late and kill you.
Professor Dawkins, are you in any way engaged, or are you planning to be engaged in the struggle for the right to euthanasia or assisted suicide in Britain? What is the current state of legislation in Britain as regards this subject?
And is there hope for improvement in the near future in Britain as regards this subject?
I'm thoroughly in favor of the right to assisted suicide. It seems to me to be monstrous that that your dog has the privilege of being able to go to the vet and be painlessly put to sleep, and you yourself are not. For myself, I could imagine going to the vet and asking for the dose for a large Alsatian, something like that.
Myślę, że czas naszego spotkania z Richardem Dawkinsem, tego zupełnie niezwykłego, wyjątkowego spotkania upłynął. Wobec powyższego jeszcze raz bardzo, bardzo serdecznie dziękuję. Dziękuję bardzo Pawłowi Golikowi również. Mogę podać rękę.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you all for being here and for asking great questions.
Thank you.